Hey guys, it's Quickie Baby, and this video is going to be to get you up to date with all of the new Japanese tanks. This is going to be a quick run over the whole of the tech tree. Look out for my other videos which will be explaining each of the tanks in more depth and giving some of my opinions as to how they might affect their tiers where they fit in. Now, I've played all of the Japanese tanks on the test server. If you want to see all of the gameplay, you can check it out on my twitch.tv channel. But I'm just going to summarize the new Japanese line for you, so maybe you can make your decisions about what tanks you really want to try and pick up and maybe which ones you want to try and skip out. So without further ado, let's have a look at the new tech tree. So here we are. This is the new Japanese line starting from tier 1 to tier 10. As you can see, there are multiple options for the tier 2, 3 and 4 tanks, which is basically a light tank line on the top and a medium tank line along the bottom. However, they both conjoin at the tier 5 Chinu, and then it's a completely linear route up towards the tier 10 medium tank, the STB1. So I'm going to talk through the light tanks first, and I must apologize if any of my Japanese pronunciation is going to be wrong. This is the Renault Otsu. This is the tier 1 tank. Like many of the tier 1 tanks, it does have an autoloader. Its armor is actually fairly okay, with 30 at the front, 30 at the sides, 20 at the rear, and the turret armor is the weakness. The hull armor is actually fairly strong. 30mm might be enough to bounce quite a few guns, especially if you angle the tank and try and get them to absorb in your tracks or bounce off your upper plates. This tank has the option of either using a 37mm cannon or using a 13mm auto cannon. You're going to pretty much want to skip your way through this, as this tank does have horrific horsepower to ton ratio of less than 10. Its also top speed limit is 23 kilometers an hour. This is one of the slowest tier 1 tanks. However, what this garage view is not showing you is how amazing the gun depression is on this tank. This tank can almost point its gun directly in front of it. What that means is that you're able to shoot down off slopes at your enemies. And although I don't have the exact figure, this tank is absolutely troll when it comes to its gun depression. It's a fairly interesting tier 1 that really is nothing like the Japanese line at all. It's really slow, it's got horrific horsepower to ton ratio, and it's fairly well armored for its tier. So now moving along to the tier 2 light, the Type 95 Hago. This tank has got 2 cannons on it, only one of them is usable. The armor now is absolutely negligible on the hull, having 12mm at the front and the side and 10 at the rear. If you get hit by an HE shell, you're probably going to die. However, at least you have some turret armor with 35 at the front and 25 at the side and the rear. And this tank is a lot faster than the tier 1, having a specific power ratio of 16.33. So that means that it can get up to its top speed limit of 40 kilometers an hour, and its traverse speed is really good at 44 degrees. This thing has got an option of 2 guns. You can either use this 57mm or the 37mm. The 57mm has pathetic penetration with its standard rounds, and realistically you need to fire a few heat rounds if you want to be able to penetrate most of the targets you're going to meet. I would personally recommend to use this 37mm, which is quite competitive at tier 2, with its 1.7 second aim time and great rate of fire. Now, the gun depression on this tank is excellent, just like the tier 1. You're really going to be able to take advantage of hills and undulations and get shots on the enemy that not many tanks in the game could make. So moving on to the tier 3, the Type 98 Kini. This tank again has absolutely no hull armor. 16mm is its thickest at the front, and its turret armor is garbage as well, with 30 at the front and 16 at the sides and rear. The mobility on this tank is even better than the tier 2, 50 kilometers an hour top speed limit, with its specific power nearly increasing to 20 horsepower per ton. This tank cannot use the 57mm, however, it uses the 37mm that I was suggesting to use on the previous tier. We can see, however, the gun for the Kini here and the gun on the previous tier on the Hago here. You can see that your penetration increases a lot, your alpha damage increases, your aim time is completely negligible, and your accuracy improves a lot, which means this fairly low caliber gun for tier 3 37mm can still be used to quite devastating effect. Keep in mind that you're going to have to continuously shoot your target. And again, this tank does have fantastic gun depression. So now the tier 4 light, the Type 5 Kiho. Now this is a true tier 4 light. It gets light matchmaking, meaning that you can meet tier 7 plus tanks in this. So you're literally going to have to be a scout if you want to choose this line to get down. The hull armor and the turret armor are almost completely worthless, with 20 at the front on the hull and 30 on the front of the turret. However, the traverse speed on this tank is ridiculous. It's got 60 degrees a second traverse speed. Its top speed limit, however, is fairly lacking at 50 kilometers an hour. And unfortunately, this tank would be absolutely beautiful if it wasn't for the fact that its engine is very underwhelming for its 10.5 ton weight. This tank has a specific power of 14. Now, I think this might get changed, but if it stays like this thing does feel rather sluggish, and it can't really use that 60 degree a second traverse speed or the 50 kilometer an hour top speed limit effectively up simple gradients. Your choice of gun, however, is rather nice on this tank, going up to a 57mm. With 2.3 seconds aim time, you're going to have to pick your shots more carefully. You've got a beautiful rate of fire of 25 rounds a minute with your average damage of 75, giving this tank some really nice DPM for a tier 4 light. If only this tank's engine was a little bit better, this would be quite a nice tier 4, and I would probably play my way up the tech tree with this tank, irrelevant of the fact that I might meet some tier 7 plus tanks. So that was the light line. Let's take a look at the medium line instead. So the tier 2 option is the Chini. This is a ridiculous looking tank. Look at this. And as you can see, there's only one turret, so you can't get a bigger turret on this tank. It looks just so silly. So this tank basically has no armor for a tier 2. Its top speed limit is a lowly 30 kilometers an hour. Its traverse speed is a great 38, however. Its engine power is 135, even though the tank nearly weighs 10 tons, which means that it's not the fastest of low-tier tanks. In the fact that it can either use that 57mm or the 37, I don't recommend the 57mm unless you want to fire some premium rounds. I do feel that the 37mm will probably do you best. However, you might struggle with that too. I really don't like the look of this tank. I would try and avoid it at most costs. So here is the tier 3, the Chiha. The Chiha goes up in caliber and it can use a 47mm gun at tier 3, which is very nice indeed. This is an inaccurate gun. However, like the other Japanese tanks, this has got excellent gun depression. Its specific power ratio is over 15, which means that it's able to traverse around fairly quickly and get up to its 40 kilometer an hour top speed limit. I don't think that this tank should be that painful to play through, so it might be worth, in my opinion, skipping out the tier 2 and starting at tier 3 if you don't have very much free experience. Here's the tier 4, the type 1 Chihi, that goes after the Chiha. This tank can either use a 57mm or a 75mm derp. The derp is very inaccurate indeed at 0.53. However, the aim time is fairly good at 2.3 for a derp. You're going to lack penetration, but you're going to really pack some alpha damage with 110. However, I would still recommend that the 57mm is probably more than enough at tier 4. When you compare this to the Matilda, however, you're really going to lack that penetration to be able to go through your targets. At least you do have some frontal armor now with 50mm on the hull and on the turret. However, considering this is a tier 4 tank, don't expect that to take much punishment, and your side armor and your rear armor are garbage. Basically, this is a fairly mobile tier 4 medium tank. There's really nothing special about it, although it does pack some gun depression. Okay, so now the line converges at the Chinu, and this is in my opinion where the tree starts to matter, as it's going to cost you 31,000 experience to research that tier 6 Cheeto. Now you guys will know that this is the Chinu Kai, which is currently available in the 8.9 patch. It's a tier 5 premium tank. I've done a full tank review on the Chinu Kai, so if you're interested in thinking about how the Chinu is going to perform, then keep in mind that video and I'll try and explain some of the differences. Firstly, to clarify that the guns on the tanks are exactly the same, so if you played the Chinu Kai, then you know exactly what to expect with the gun on the Chinu. The main differences are the fact that the turret armor is actually weaker on the Chinu, but the turret traverse is much better. Now, the Chinu Kai's turret armor with 75mm at the front at least was capable of bouncing occasionally. The turret armor on the Chinu, the non-premium tank, is going to be 50mm at the front, but the turret traverse increases to 36 from 30, which is a very welcome change. Now, the main differences between the Chinu and the Chinu Kai is the fact that Chinu is slightly lighter and its engine power is significantly better. In fact, the Chinu gets a specific power of over 15 horsepower to ton, whereas the Chinu Kai has just over 11. Unfortunately, the track traverse in the Chinu does degrade slightly to 34 from 38. However, the engine power difference is really going to allow this to be a lot faster to accelerate and get around the battlefield compared to its premium counterpart. So in a nutshell, the Chinu is a lighter version of the Chi with a more powerful engine which allows it to accelerate more quickly. However, its turret armor is weaker, but its turret traverse is better, but it does lose some track traverse as well. Considering that I didn't really like the Chi, I don't really think the Chi is going to be a very good performer. However, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a viable tank to play through. But when we compare it to some of the other tier 5 tanks in the game, it's really not going to be one that you're going to want to keep in your garage. So now we're moving on to the tier 6 medium tank, and it's where the line starts to get fat. Look at this Cheeto. This Type 4 Cheeto seems to have eaten all the pies. And it's worth mentioning that the Cheeto is where the line starts to become prototypes rather than tanks that were actually produced in World War II like the Chi-Nu. The tier 5 Chi-Nu, there were 60 of them made in total, with no more made being due to shortages as the game tooltip tells us. The tier 6 Cheeto had 6 chassis produced, but only 2 tanks were actually built on their basis. So the Type 4 Cheeto has a fantastic amount of hit points at 820. And it really needs them because its hull armor is 75mm at the front, 35 at the side, and 35 at the rear. And its turret armor is 75 at the front, 50 at the side, and 50 at the rear, which basically means that this is a big box with quite a lot of health but not a lot of armor to go around. Now this tank has a Mitsubishi engine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have a good specific power ratio, which is just over 12 tons, which means this is actually a very slow medium tank. Now, whereas it does have a fairly good top speed limit of 45 kilometers an hour, this sluggish horsepower to ton ratio is going to make it quite slow to traverse the battlefield, especially considering its traverse speed is only 30 degrees a second. Now, you'd be right in thinking that you'd hope that this tank would have a gun that would make it competitive, and you'll be happy to hear that the gun depression, although it's not as extreme on the tiers 1 to 4 tanks, is still available, and you will be able to use your gun depression quite effectively in the Cheeto. Now, this tank does have a very competitive gun for a tier 6 medium tank, 130 alpha damage with 15.79 rate of fire, 155mm of penetration with its standard ammunition, 0.36 accuracy and 2.1 second aim time. It's fairly similar to the Chi-Nu's gun, 75mm. It's just a little bit better, basically. It's a better version of the Chi-Nu's gun. So this tier 6 Cheeto gun, the best way that I'd like to tell you guys is it is a Cromwell gun. So effectively, that's a very nice gun to have on a tier 6 medium tank. It's just a shame that this really isn't a medium in my opinion. It's a gigantic box of a tank with very little armor and not enough speed to truly call itself a medium tank. I would consider this to be more like a lightly armored heavy, and I don't really think that this tank is going to be able to compete that well against such tanks as the M6, for example. This is slower than the KV-1S, it's more lightly armored than the KV-1S, it doesn't have the alpha damage of the KV-1S, but fair enough, it has some DPM. This really isn't going to be a very competitive tank in my opinion, especially considering its view range is unexceptional as well at 360. This is unfortunate because you're going to have to get 52,000 experience points to get the Chiri, which is the tier 7 Japanese medium tank. So looking at the Chiri here, you can see that it's again a gigantic box of a tank. It's very similar in mobility to the Cheeto, as its specific power is just shy of 13 tons. Its track traverse is 34, and its top speed limit is slightly lower at 42 kilometers an hour. This tank, again, gets a huge amount of hit points, 1,250 for a tier 7 medium. And its armor, again, is absolutely nothing special, with 75 at the front, 75 on the turret, although it's a gigantic target that you'd really have to try and miss. Pathetic side hull armor of 35, 35 on the rear, and 50-50 on the turret. Fortunately, this is where the tank starts to develop this gigantic cupola, which is very annoying for trying to hide. One of the strengths of the Japanese tanks is their excellent gun depression. However, if you have gigantic soft cupolas on the top of your tank, it's going to be an absolute pain. Now, what you need to know about this tank is that it does indeed get the same 75mm as the previous tank. As an option here, it's got a brilliant rate of fire, it's got a very low aim time, and its accuracy is good. However, its penetration dynamics and its alpha damage are not special for tier 7. But this tank becomes first tier 7 medium tank in the game with an autoloader. Now again, I'm just going to go over this quickly because I'll be doing more detailed videos on the tier 7 plus tanks. But as you can see, this autoloader fires 3 shells with only 1 second delay between the shells. So that means that it can fire all 3 of its shells within 2 seconds after the first one is fired. And its time of loading another 3 shells is only 10 seconds. That's got a very underwhelming alpha damage of 130. But when you multiply that by 3, it becomes 390. Being able to do 390 damage in 2 seconds is pretty brutal, especially when you want to finish off those really low health targets. If you come around the corner, you might be able to finish off a low target and plant your other 2 into the other tank and then pull back. Now, its aiming time is very, very low indeed, which means that you can probably afford to use binoculars on this tank. It cannot use vertical stabilizers at tier 7. However, very interestingly at the moment, it can use a gun rammer. I'm not sure if that's intended. I didn't think any of the autoloaders in the game had gun rammers available. We'll see at full release if that is still available or not. But that gun rammer significantly reduces this 10-second reload time. When you're using vents and other crew skills, it does go to about 8 seconds to reload the 3 shells, which is pretty good for 390 alpha damage. Still, having this autoloader doesn't really make up for the fact that this is a gigantic box of a tank that isn't really a medium. The best description that I heard was likening this to an AMX M4 with an autoloader. So now we're moving along to the STA1. We can see this is a very funky looking tank. Looks like a T-28 prototype combined itself with a generic American medium tank. It looks absolutely awesome. Now this tank has a lovely 1,450 hit points. It's not the heaviest of tanks at 35 tons, and thank goodness it starts to regain some medium-like engine power with this Mitsubishi 570 brake horsepower engine. One thing I will highlight at the moment is that there are 2 options for the guns on this tank. You can either use this 90mm rifled gun, or you can use this 90mm Type 61 gun. Interestingly, this rifled gun is only used on the STA1, and it costs 19,000 experience to research. When we look at it compared to the 90mm that you have to research to get to the Type 61, we can see the rate of fire is the same, the penetration is significantly less, and the accuracy is less. Okay, well, I don't think I'll be spending that 19,000 experience. So guys, what I believe is that originally they were thinking about putting this 90mm on the tier 7 Chiri. Obviously, you would have to have this unlocked on the Chiri before you went and moved on to the SDA1. I believe this is a relic that's left over, and it really has absolutely no use on the SDA1. Of course, I haven't considered that there might be a difference in the gun depression. However, I considered that very unlikely, and I really think this is just a relic that might have been at one point used on the Chiri. So looking at this 90mm gun Type 61 that's on the SDA1, it's a fantastic weapon. 218mm of penetration with 8 rounds a minute, with 240 alpha damage, 0.36 accuracy, and 2.3 seconds aim time. The best thing for me to do is to compare this to the Centurion Mark 1's gun, the 20-pounder that we can see here, and also to the Indenpanzer's gun, the Indenpanzer's 90mm. So here we can see the Indenpanzer's gun, the Centurion's gun, and the ST1's gun. So the rate of fire is the same on the STA1 and the Indenpanzer. Penetration is best on the Centurion, followed by the STA1, followed by the Indenpanzer. The alpha damage is better on the STA1 and the Indenpanzer. The accuracy is best on the Centurion, then the Indenpanzer, and then the STA1. And the aim time is very good on the Centurion and the SDA1, but really bad on the Indenpanzer. So there's no one tank that's got overall benefit. The DPM is much lower on the Centurion 1 compared to both of the other tanks. However, the Centurion 1 packs that extra punch with its penetration with its standard rounds, and it also has the best accuracy and the best aim time. The Indenpanzer really flags with its aim time. The aim time is one of the worst things about the Indenpanzer gun. And myself as a player that likes to be fairly active with his aim time, I would really think that for me personally, the Indenpanzer gun is the weakest of the 3. I would actually be bold enough to say that I think that the STA1's gun is the best, with the DPM increase over the Centurion. However, it still has that excellent aim time, but the accuracy is slightly lacking compared to the Centurion's gun. However, now you know that this tank is definitely going to be no slouch when you're starting to say that, in my opinion, it's got a better gun than the Centurion 1, which is a remarkable 20-pounder to have at a tier 8 tank. And it's definitely the speciality of the Centurion. So there've got to be things that make this tank weak. And that's the very low amount of hull armor, 45 at the front, 35 at the sides, and 25 at the rear. And the turret armor is fairly troll. I'll go into more depth when we do a full review on this tank. 70 at the front, 60 at the sides, and 35 at the rear. We can see the angling on the front is quite nice, and this mantlet seems to be fairly troll. Interestingly as well, this cupola, which I'll go into more depth in other videos, you can see it has an angled front, so I'm not sure how that's going to affect it. I'll do some analysis using WOT Tank Viewer. This tank also marks where the turret traverse starts to become excellent with 42 degrees a second, and its view range does take the jump up to 390 meters. So considering that the traverse speed on the tank is 44 degrees, the top speed limit is 45, and the engine power is pretty darn good, this is a fairly mobile tier 8 medium tank with a really good gun. And for me personally, this is where the tree starts to become really playable. I really like the look of this tank, and I feel that this is going to be where the tree becomes sweet for me. I can't wait to play the SDA-1. I think I'm going to just try and get through the Chi-Ri as quickly as I can, and then try and pick up the SDA-1. I might even think about free experiencing all the way to the SDA-1. And that's just how much I like it. I think this might be the sweet spot to start at for a player who has got a lot of free experience saved up. I can't wait to see how it performs. So once you've researched that 41,000 experience gun, and then you've researched the 169,000 experience Type 61 tank, you're going to have one of the most interesting tier 9 mediums in the game. As we can see, it's very tall. It's very similar to, for example, a VK4502A from the side. That's really not a very good thing considering its side armor is really bad, 35 at the side on the hull and 25 at the rear. And its turret armor is 60 on the side. However, one interesting thing is that there's actually an ammo box at the tank. We did some testing and you can actually shoot through this. So the turret armor only starts here, but you know, from the side, that's a gigantic profile. Just stick your gun there, and unless you get really unlucky and shoot through there, you're just going to massacre the side of this tank. The armor profile on the top as well is very weak, and expect to take large amounts of artillery damage if you do end up getting hit. Now this tank has got 1,700 hit points, which is very meaty indeed. It has a great engine power of 604, which allows its 35-ton tank to absolutely motor around the battlefield faster than any of the mediums that we've had so far above tier 5, with a specific power of 17 horsepower per ton. Now the speed limit on this tank is 47.6 kilometers an hour. Traverse speed is an excellent 48 degrees, and the turret traverse is 42 degrees a second, and it does start to get what I would call, you know, the kind of tier 9, tier 10 view range of 400 meters. I will highlight, however, that you've got this ridiculous R2-D2 kind of thing. It looks like an alien just landed from space and wedged itself in top of this tank. This can be a fairly good thing, as this does count as a viewport, so you can almost like poke over slopes using your viewport. However, you will get spotted, and if you can see the enemy with your gun, they definitely can see you, and they can just shoot this all day long. It's a gigantic weak point on top of the tank. So far you must be thinking, well, this is a fairly mobile, gigantic box of a tank with very low armor and weak points. What's special about it? And that is this 105mm rifled gun. This is an absolute beast of a gun, and it's probably a contender for the best tier 9 gun, at least on any of the medium tanks, but possibly on any of the tanks. Now, why is this gun so special? Well, the tank's got an excellent aim time of 2.3 seconds. Its accuracy is okay at 0.36. The alpha damage is standard for 105mm of 390. It's got a great penetration of 258, and it fires APCR as standard, which means that its shells have got a very high velocity speed. Now, this is the strength, 6 rounds a minute rate of fire on a tier 9 medium. Now that 6 rounds a minute doesn't seem very impressive compared to the E50's gun, considering the E50 has recently been buffed and received 6.25 rounds a minute. However, the main difference is that the penetration on the E50 is 38mm less than on the Type 61. Its accuracy, fair enough, is a lot better, and its aim time is a touch better. However, really, that E50's penetration is not enough to really blast its way through the front of most tier 10 tanks, whereas this rifled gun on the Type 61 is. Better comparison is looking at the gun on the Centurion 7.1. You lose a little bit of penetration compared to the gun on the Centurion 7.1, 10mm, and a little bit of accuracy, but you gain 20% DPM compared to the Centurion 7.1, which is massive. And it's the same as the Leopard prototype. You'll know that the 105 is very similar. When you upgrade the turret on the Leopard prototype, this does go up to 5 rounds a minute, and the aim time does get better. So basically what we're looking at here on the Type 61 is a gun that's sort of mixed between the E50's gun and a gun that's mixed between the gun on the Centurion 7.1. Penetration is slightly less, but significantly better than the E50's. Its accuracy does take a hit, but its rate of fire goes up astronomically. So if you can make the gun on the Centurion 7-1 and the Leopard prototype work, then you sure as hell are going to be able to make the gun on this Type 61 work. And that's why this tank becomes quite exciting for me. I think the fact that it's got some really bad features like the cupola on the top and its armor is not very strong will not make it amazingly better than, for example, the Centurion 7-1. But having that extra 20% top speed limit and the fact that you've got 20% more DPM really makes it a contender. You guys will know that Centurion 7-1 is a very strong tank. Having that extra top speed to allow you to get places quicker, as well as the extra DPM, that's what I'm really looking forward to. And I think the Type 61 will be a really nice tank to play through. I'll do a video on this tank and make it quite detailed, so definitely stay tuned for that. Now for what many of you have been waiting for, this is the Tier 10 Japanese medium tank, the STB-1. And you'll be forgiven for saying it looks quite futuristic for this game. And that's because wargaming are really, in my opinion, starting to push the boundary in a way. There were 2 prototypes made of this. One was manufactured in 1969, and in 1970 the prototypes were shown to journalists in a military parade. So in fact this really is a 1970s tank that never really came to fruition. But let's not discuss whether 1970s tanks should be in the game. Let's take a look at how it's been balanced to be able to fit in. Now again, this is going to be a quick run through. I'll be doing a more detailed approach to the analysis on this tank. Just to let you know that this tank does indeed have a standard hit points of 1,950. Its weight limit is just shy of 38 tons when it's fully equipped. And it's got an excellent engine of 750 brake horsepower, which means that this tank has got a specific power of just shy of 20 tons. Now the top speed limit on this tank is an excellent 53 kilometers an hour. That's really nice. And its traverse speed is also a brilliant 52 degrees a second. Now its hull armor is 110 on the front, 35 on the side, and 25 on the rear. There's quite a large gap that you can see in between the tracks here. That is just a gigantic weak point, really. And this lip here isn't really spaced. What this means is that if you catch this tank from the side, you're going to absolutely wreck it. And if you catch it from the rear, you're absolutely going to wreck it. Now, its turret armor is fairly interesting. On paper, it says it's 132, but I can tell you that its mantlet at the front of the tank is very troll indeed. Its side armor is 132 as well, and it's very well angled, which means that you can get bounces. However, I've noticed that there's a divide. If you're aiming at an STB-1, you want to be aiming here, back, and you will penetrate nearly every time. If you hit here forwards, it's likely to bounce. Tank does have a cupola. It's not that prominent, but it still can be taken advantage of in a one-on-one situation. So okay, this tank has also got other standard Tier 10 medium tank stats like 42 degrees a second turret traverse and 410 meters view range. So now, why is this tank going to be really quite powerful? Well, here's the 105mm rifled gun. And that's right, 7.5 rounds a minute. This is absolutely huge. It's 10% more than, for example, an M48 pattern. It's nearly 20% more than, for example, the FE4202. This tank is going to have insane DPM, and its average penetration is still a very nice 258. The only downside to this gun is that its accuracy is 0.36, which means that sometimes the game's going to troll you and you're going to miss your shots. However, the 2.1 second aim time combined with vertical stabilizers doesn't really mean that you have to aim at the targets very much. Now, one of the soft stats, so to say, that you won't be able to see is the gun depression on this tank, and you'll be happy to hear that it is 10 degrees, meaning that with the FE4202, this is the joint highest gun depression at tier 10. That's unbelievably powerful. I'm a very big FE4202 driver, and looking at this, I would trade it at a drop of a hat right now. Just get rid of my FE4202. What's the point? I'll have an STB-1. I gain 13 kilometers an hour top speed limit. I gain nearly 20% DPM. I do lose some of the armor on my tank, but at least my turret is going to be better at the front. I really think that these tanks are going to be absolutely brutal on the battlefield. I would liken it to basically a Leopard 1, which forgoes a little bit of the accuracy on the gun and its top speed limit, but just sheer brutality with its DPM, and also actually having armor that can bounce shells. Everyone will know when you're shooting at a Leopard 1 that really it's not going to be able to bounce you. Well, this tank definitely can indeed bounce quite a lot of shells, and it's undoubtedly going to have a large impact at tier 10. Now, I don't think it's going to have the impact that, for example, some of the other tier 10s have had when they've been introduced. Think about the FV215183 as an example. That introduced a one-hit gun. Think about the Waffenträger Alfie 100. When that was introduced, there was now a tank in the game that was capable of literally killing any tank with one clip. The STB-1 doesn't really add that kind of amazing feature. What it does do, however, is combine a lot of the other tank's strengths without taking on any of the extreme weaknesses. I'm definitely going to pick one of these up, and I think it'll probably be my favorite tank in the game. But that's just because it seems to be the stats that I really like. I want to have some turret armor at the front. I want to have some hull armor at the front that I can use. I want to have the gun depression, and this has got the best, and I want to have some DPM. And that is what the STB1 is all going to be about. So anyway, guys, this video has been the overview of the new Japanese tech tree. Hopefully you now know all about the Japanese tanks that are going to be added. If you've enjoyed this video or it's been helpful to you, please consider rating it down below. I'd really appreciate it. Tell me what you think about the new Japanese tech tree, especially where you think you're going to jump in. Maybe you're the kind of player who's been saving up a lot of free experience. What kind of a tier are you thinking of free experiencing to? Personally, I'm thinking about jumping in at tier 8, possibly tier 7, and hopefully I've justified that to you guys. Anyway, I'm going to keep working and try and get you more detailed videos with gameplay now of all the different high-tier Japanese tanks. Hopefully you'll enjoy them and check them out. But as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.